it was probably singular in Southeast Asia, that you had the kind of free press that was modeled after the US model. We were adversarial, we were critical. There was also very good writing going on at that time. We were also not so parochial. By we, I don't mean we because I was not yet a member of the press at the time, but basically the journalists who wrote their reports had a lot of seasoning from just covering the beats for a great length of time, and so developed their contacts and developed their ears and their nose for, you know, the kind of news that they should include in the news agenda. The editors, while they were owned by businessmen, while the news organizations owned by businessmen who had interests other than the press, they were basically let alone to determine what was going to come out and not come out. So we had a pretty good model. It wasn't perfect. We were in a period of development of our own press instruments that showed a capacity to become what could have been a great model for Asia. And martial law killed it.
So you had the beginnings of a press that was concerned with national issues and that was eager to see, and that was echoing to some extent the demand for change. During the martial law period, all of that disappeared. All of that disappeared because among other reasons, those journalists who were doing this kind of work were the first to be arrested. And also the magazines were among those that were immediately shut down.
The declaration of martial law meant that all of these news organizations were closed down, including radio, including television, and it was taken over by government. Basically, the government wanted to establish a government-controlled press and determined only those who they knew would carry the government line and would not question that kind of regulation.
So what you had was supposedly a new situation in which the press were under control, under regulation by the government, on the theory that the press needed to be a partner of government, not its adversary.
Then was taken over by a stronger instrument, in fact, what we call the alternative press, or what was called the mosquito press. It provided the forum to hear all the different voices, including those that were underground. I mean, we were able to do interviews with Teodoro and all the different communist leaders. We were able to draw out the leaders of the Muslim insurgencies, as well as the growing, what people call the cause-oriented front, which were organizations that were set out really to express their dissatisfaction. They probably had links to the armed groups, but they were clearly the National Democratic Front was clearly the legitimate front that basically represented not just the left, but the whole range, actually. Also began to build up their own different organizations that were separate from the NDF, and so you had this very rich forum of ideas of what we would become after Marcos goes.
We must remember that those 14 years were repressive years. Our own dark age. It was a time when there was that prevented the cultivation of any democratic values. truth, freedom, justice. And it is only in an environment where there is enough truth revealed, there is enough freedom exercised, there is enough justice dispensed, that moral and professional values can flourish. That's why there has been a deterioration since of moral and professional values. But even if you guarantee truth, freedom, and justice, you can only do so largely theoretically, because you have not actually dismantled the very infrastructure that supports the culture of patronage that operated in during martial law and continue effectively to operate today.
In the transition, we of course had lost a generation of experienced journalists. They were either too old to go after the stories, except for a few, or some were simply no longer interested in coming back to covering the news.
So you had a situation in which I think there was a decline in the quality of Philippine journalism as a result of the martial law period.
So, here was this woman with this historic task of making the Philippines work as a democracy. And if you review the coverage at the time, we all basically agreed that no one was getting at the institutional questions, that the different roles of Congress and the different roles of the executive and the judiciary were not clear to those covering those different beats, through no fault of their own. This was the first time they had been exposed to these things. When we held the first election, people didn't know where to start, because some of those who were covering had never even voted in their lives. And so the whole learning process was happening even as they were covering. And yet, the importance of the press had become so embedded in the political life of the country that everyone, they got the kind of circulation that they needed to make the enterprise grow. Television was a growing, dynamic medium. And so the romance with the media and the news media began. And the news sections of television and radio became money makers as such, which would have been good. But money making, when you're out to just look at the bottom line of your production, you are going to go and tend to determine the kinds of stories that you're going to do based on their commercial and popular appeal. And that has held, I think, even to this day, that we have to make the money, and therefore we need to bring in all of these other things. And the whole, therefore, of what we had learned before martial law about the value of news in the growth of a country, that was eroded by the developments all around the world of a highly commercial media enterprise ruling the field of journalism.
The lesson is that we haven't recovered from it. The first thing that we should do is sort out the records of martial law. Sort out our history. Because history continues to be confused by the heirs of the dictatorship. They continue to hold Marcos up and his own regime as a model, of leadership. So this is what we should do. Sort out the records. correct our history. And especially now that uh, the uh, the majority of our citizens know scarcely anything or nothing at all firsthand about martial law.
There are a lot of secrets that the martial law period had succeeded in keeping. It was necessary to uncover all of those secrets so that people will understand why Philippine society is the way it is. Now, whether the press still is aware of it or still remembers it is something else.
I thought it was necessary to have journalists who had experienced both the qualities of an emergent developing press before martial law, to have basically hoped that we would have grown from that into something even better now that we had gotten our freedom, and to be faced instead with a kind of conflicting objectives that are now embedded in any media enterprise, not just in the Philippines but everywhere in the world.
I think that that despite the efforts of the organizations that emerged in the immediate post-martial law period, some of these lessons have never been learned or have been forgotten. And part of the reason, I think, is because, I think this is a failure of the education of journalists. I think there has not been enough emphasis on this, and again, the absence of that kind of emphasis can be traced to on the fact that the martial law period tends to be what? Tends to be underestimated, no? Tends to be underemphasized. Among other reasons, because there has not been enough public attention focused on what it meant, what it did, and how it came about, and what its consequences were.